Garrett, how long will your lecture be?
So it's, it's a good question. I didn't do it in slides because I want to be able to like, so I'm gonna try to do, I'm looking at like, it's about, how many pages is this? It's 8 pages of typed, but like, I'll go through it pretty quickly. I mean, I think like somewhere between half an hour and 45 minutes is what I would guess. At least I'll try to keep it to that. It also depends on how many questions I get along the way, because I generally ask everyone to ask questions like as I'm presenting rather than at the end. But we're also going to do this thing that I call many tasking, which is like all of us going into the same Google Doc and being able to make edits to things at the same time, which can be kind of chaotic, but is actually a lot of fun. And so I'll introduce that concept. I've used that methodology for, gosh, almost 20 years, maybe about 20 years. And, back, when Excel, I used to do it with Excel on a shared drive at GE. And what I would do is I would get a bunch of us into one Excel doc. But the problem was that before Google Docs, it wasn't real time. So what you would have to do is everybody had to save their doc every couple minutes to like see everybody else's updates. So it's much cooler with Google Docs when you can see everybody like working real time. But
that's cool.
The idea is we're all like working in the same doc at the same time to like, sort of put our thoughts forward, and then we can talk about, and debate anything that's like a conflict or like, whatever we want to talk about, we can talk about, but people can also sort of put their thoughts on paper and sort of, it tends to be a pretty efficient way to work, quite frankly. Unlike multitasking, which is provably a horrible, horrible way to work. One person working on many tasks is a really bad idea. What it turns out is that many people working on one task is actually a really good idea. So it just totally the opposite methodology. And I find many tasking very worthwhile, whereas multitasking is something that I try to avoid like the plague. And I even taught a class in one of my companies about how bad people are at multitaskers, like using it like a demonstration, like an example of how bad people are at multitasking, using a very simple example.
Cool. So that kind of answers my my next two questions, which were, will that document be available?
It will.
Assuming it will be. And
I'm going to make it shareable, and we'll all jump into it.
Okay. And the recording?
I record everything, so this is going to go up on our YouTube channel. So we put a disclaimer. Yeah, I like to put everything up on YouTube so that people who can't make it, like someone mentioned to me that the State of the Union is tonight, not to make anyone leave if they wanted the State of the Union rather than this. But if you did, like, State of the Union is an important speech, but I don't watch TV ever at all. So I wasn't like, for me, it wasn't a competition. I didn't even know it was tonight, or I probably would have considered like punting this week. But that said, for those that wanted to watch the State of the Union, they can watch the recording. And we're trying to create a body of knowledge, of like practical knowledge that'll be useful to people. Like tonight is more of like a, I hope that it will be like useful knowledge for people, but like it's a little less in the realm of like personal development, which is a lot of, if I go back to the Freethinker Institute slide, like what we really want to do is create a community of people who want to be the best version of themselves, and have an open mind towards what will make them the best version of themselves and help them seek truth. And we want to hone our critical thinking skills to be better at better decision makers. And I'm trying to create a community of people that are really passionate about those things, so that we can help each other in sort of pursuing excellence. What the Greeks would call arete. There was a woman named Arete. She's the one that actually had to go to the State of the Union. So, but I love the name. It's like a Greek word for like this combination of like honor, valor, heroism. It's like this really cool word that evolved throughout ancient Greece and was used in different ways at different times. But that was, it was like the Spartan army was the most feared land force on earth at the time, and they were really striving for RSA. And little of my ancient Greco-Roman history coming out from college. It was one of my guilty pleasures as a computer science major with taking history courses. And yeah, so, and ironically, I got worse grades in history than I did in computer science. Not all the time, but one of my grades was a B, and that didn't go over well with me. But I actually deserved it. I just didn't spend enough time because I was too focused on my CS courses. So anyway, I digress. But the idea of the Freethinker Institute, like I said, is like a community of people that want to help each other be the best version of themselves, and make the world a better place by helping increase happiness and decrease harm for the people we can influence. And ultimately, we want to enable transformational personal and professional growth of members and help each other do that, really. And I have a saying: if we don't help each other, who's going to help us? So I really want to create a community of people willing to help each other, and therefore able to be helped by other members of the community. And any help that you don't think is going to help you, you can always ignore. But let's offer the advice to each other and grow from the advice that resonates with us. And that's really the vision of the Freethinker Institute, and that's what this this meetup is organized through my not-for-profit. And so I'm going to post in the chat. We have an online community where it's a little bit active, and we're trying to get it more active, where we stay in touch throughout the week. And so I'll post the online community, the YouTube channel, the website, and the main meetup. There's a bunch of meetups that this event was advertised to, but the main meetup is the Freethinker Institute meetup. And yeah, so I'm going to give my sort of caveats before I go to the doc. Let me actually share the doc so that people can go in it, because I want you guys to feel free to read ahead. I don't mind if people want to read ahead. It's up to you, like how you want to spend your time. I have another saying, which is that power should be used to empower rather than to overpower. I don't want to make you pay attention to me. I want you to focus on what you think is the most important. And you're welcome. Like if you're one of those people that likes to read something rather than hear about it, you're a more visual learner like I am, quite frankly. I would probably be the guy that's like reading ahead instead of listening to me, except I'm going to be talking. But so I don't take that personally at all. It's just a difference in learning style. If you're a visual learner, you'll probably do better just reading the doc. And if you're an audio learner, then you'll do better listening to what I say. And so we have both styles, and I want to let people use the style that's most conducive to their learning style. So with that said, I'm going to post the doc in the chat. And what I'm going to do is basically present my sort of first crack. It's not really my first crack because I've done a couple of iterations on it, of like what I call fair capitalism. And I'm starting from a place of capitalism. That doesn't mean we have to stick to that. Like if someone wants to propose something else being better, you're welcome to do that. And, it's not off the table. It's just when I considered economic, paradigms, I find that capitalism is good at a lot of things, and then it's got a lot of flaws. And so what I try to do is use it for what it's good at, and then patch up the flaws with, policy. And what we're going to talk about, and I'll talk about sort of what we're going to delve a little bit more than just economic systems. We're going to get into some like tax policy and stuff like that, which I think is very relevant to an economic system, because the way that I would patch up what I consider some of the flaws of capitalism are with those policies. So that's why I'm bringing those things in. That said, like I'm going to kind of present this, and I have a policy, which for those that haven't come to events in the past, I like people to ask questions along the way. So feel free to like raise your hand. Feel free to interrupt me. If you raise your hand, I actually am pretty good about noticing when people raise their hand and then finishing a thought and then calling on someone. But if you want to interrupt me, that's fine too. But I always thought that I wouldn't notice people raising their hand, but I keep the video right up, and so I do actually notice it. So, but if you notice that I'm not calling on you after I finish a thought, then definitely interrupt me, because then I missed it. And I don't mean to do that. I'll be trying to pay attention. That said, I'll kind of present like one paradigm for what I think is a good economic system, and then the goal is for us to take that to the next level, improve on it, and sort of shoot holes in the things that are bad about what I'm proposing, and then, improve on it and craft an even better policy together collaboratively in, I was mentioning earlier, what I call many tasking, which is all of us working on, one task at the same time, which is creating a great economic system, one that is far better than what we live in today, or what is even in any part of the world today. And I think that is possible. I'm a dreamer. I have my hobby is practical philosophy. The Freethinker Institute was born out of my hobby, being practical philosophy, and one of my papers is why I'm a realistic idealist and why you should be one too. So I'll post that to the Freethinker Institute reference channel for anyone that wants to read it. I think I have a pretty good convincing argument why everybody should be a realistic idealist. You don't have to choose realist or idealist. You can be both. And I would argue that, let me do that right now. I don't think you have to choose both. You can be both. And I would argue both is the best of both worlds. So that's why I wrote the paper. So with that said, any questions before I get started? I am going to have like a sort of a brief sort of question. Like, I want to talk about guiding principles because I think it's good to have a common goal. One of the things that I learned in my GE leadership training is, in black belt change acceleration training, was that you should have a common goal to work towards as a group, and that kind of brings people together. And I think that this is a very often divisive and emotionally laden topic, and so I want to have, if we can, come to common goals, and we may not get unanimity, but if we can at least get consensus on what we're trying to achieve, that would be great. And Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so one question that I already have is that, well, prevent unnecessary harm, this is easier to identify when something is causing harm. Although it's still not always easy, because you usually have to compare harm, say, to one group against another group, and that can raise a lot of questions. But still, happiness is a little more difficult concept to quantify. If we stick to something like fundamental human rights, yes, there are some basic things that if people don't have them, then they probably would not be happy no matter what. But above and beyond this, it becomes pretty ambiguous concept, and I'm not sure. So it's like, it sounds good.
Let me try to clarify. Yeah, let me try to clarify, Michael, what I mean by happiness. What I mean is, if someone asks a person, "Are you happy?" and they say yes or no. So it's basically the culmination of all the things that that person desires in life. In philosophy, it's called flourishing, mostly because people debated what is happiness so much that someone came up with the name flourishing to give an alternative. But essentially it just means achieving one's desires, or basically whatever people want is that they feel makes them happy, is what I mean by happiness. So let's make it not ambiguous. It's very individual, and every individual has their own definition of what makes them happy, and that's fine. What we're saying, what I'm saying as and you're giving a good lead into what I'm calling the guiding principles, and I don't want to spend too much time on them. I just want to say that preventing unnecessary harm, and when I say harm, I mean a person defines that they were harmed, and that a jury of peers would agree that that harm was significant harm and unnecessary harm. And so that's what I mean by harm, is that someone says that they were harmed, and then a jury of peers would agree that that was harm. A jury of reasonable people is the paradigm used in the legal profession. And then happiness is whatever people want to achieve, like that makes them happy from their own perspective, totally subjective, like doesn't need to be any objective agreement on what makes someone happy. Like everyone can choose individually, whatever makes them happy is fine. So that's what I mean by those things. Does that make sense?
No, I'm hung up on the word unnecessary. In other words, somebody could be harmed and the jury says, well, it was necessary for the greater good.
So let's not get into the legal definition, but like understand that there is.
I'm not talking about law.
Right. So use your own definition of necessary, Jeff. So just keep it simple. If you think it's necessary, it was necessary. If you don't, it wasn't. And we will each do the same thing in interpreting that statement. So, and that's really what it's intended to be, is that, you know, a jury of peers, which is this audience is a jury of peers. And so each one of us will use our own judgment. And if we need to get into a specific situation tonight, like when we talk about, is this causing unnecessary harm or not, we can all kind of say our pros and cons, and then we can take a vote and say whether or not that's unnecessary harm. You know, I would say like, we're probably not going to get to that level of granularity, but if we do, that's fine. We can have that conversation. Does that make sense, Jeff?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
Okay.
we can move on. I just want to put that out there because
Yeah,
I was
no, look,
curious
we can debate what the word definition means all night. Like, like, don't get me
no,
wrong.
I don't
like,
mean
every-
definition.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying like every word, like there is no clear definition of any word in existence. Like everything is subject to interpretation, and you know, and so yeah.
I was just curious why you included the word unnecessary.
Because right, like you can't say to prevent all significant harm, because you know, some harm is necessary. And so for example, if someone believes in the death penalty and that someone has done something so egregious that they should die, you're causing harm, but you know, that society agrees that that's necessary harm, and that's a bad example. Let's say someone had a disease like as spreadable as coronavirus, but it killed 90% of the population, but someone caught it early enough that was the only person that had it. What should you do? Like, you know, maybe killing that person is actually justifiable to prevent that disease from spreading to the world and killing 90% of the world's population. So that's a necessary harm. That's like a really clear example.
Right, the trolley car problem. Yep.
Yeah. So let's,
Okay.
I'm happy to take questions, but let's try to keep it short because we barely started and we have like a bunch of hands up. So Remco, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Garrett. Look, I don't want to hold up your presentation, and I hope we get stuck into it pretty soon. And I got some ideas for it. I think it's a great topic, and I'm really looking forward to it. But I just wanted to say two things. One in particular is, you know, there's a famous painting of by Raphael, and it shows the philosophers, and it has Aristotle with his finger in the air, and walking beside him is Plato with his hand like that. You know, the point is Aristotle was a dreamer. He was an idealist, and I think it's important to respect that, you know, some of the ideas that might come forward might be wanting to be criticized because for being impractical. But I'm just endorsing what you said. I think it's very important to throw a dream out there, throw a vision out there, and see what comes back. And I think we need to be open to it and not get stuck on individual terms and practicalities and all of that. I'm a dreamer too, Garrett, and you know, a few years ago I stepped into India and declared My Clean India, and 7 years after I stepped in, and I'm not an activist, I got Prime Minister Modi to declare what I declared, My Clean India. So I'm a dreamer too, and I just wanted to endorse you. And let's get going, because the world really needs to be dreamers.
You know, and the reason that I say I'm a practical idealist, just to summarize the paper, is that I think it's great to shoot for ideals, but to have a practical approach to shooting for those ideals. And so saying, let's just suppose that everybody had so much money that, you know, like everybody makes $1 billion a year. And so all famine is ended. And, you know, like we can't just assume all those things are true, because while that ideally would be nice, it's so impractical that it's not really worth spending time on. At the same time, like being so pragmatic that you say, this sounds unachievable, even though theoretically we could easily do it in 100 years, given the pace of technology. Well, let's accept that maybe we won't do it this year, maybe we won't do it next year, but maybe 100 years from now we can achieve that goal. And maybe it's 200 years from now. And, let's just keep an open mind towards pragmatism of like, balancing out, which I think is what you're saying, Remco, which is let's dream big. And then, as long as it's not super unrealistic, let's just have an open mind, dream big, and look at it as a very long-term goal, even if it's not something that we can achieve even the next 10 or 50 or even 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's leave the pragmatism and the practicalities to others. I think, I think it's healthy to us to step beyond the boundaries of realism sometimes. I'm passionately committed to that. I think it's vitally important that we continue to throw things up, and then let's leave it to others. Let's not have a debate with each other whether it's workable or not in the current atmosphere. Who knows what the next few years will hold for us.
Agreed.
Anyway, just wanted to say that.
Go ahead next.
Sure. Should we have edit access to the document now, or is that to be reserved for later on in the session?
You should. And in fact, given the way things are going, what I'm going to suggest people do is be comfortable editing. I made a copy of this before the event, so everyone's welcome to make edits. Actually, I should make everybody commenters, if you don't mind, because I don't want people to edit. I want them to like do suggested changes. And so in the upper right hand corner, you see like editing, and there's suggesting and there's viewing. You want to say suggesting. And what that does is it highlights the changes that you've made on the screen. And so that way we can all see like what's different from the original that I created. And that way, like when I'm walking through, I won't get confused about what you wrote versus what I wrote. I'll at least know, what I wrote versus what someone else added, and we can talk about it then. And to answer also, to give an addendum to the person that asked how long the lecture will go, it's, if it goes like this, it's going to be a conversation. It's going to last 2 hours. So we're going to like walk through the whole document, like slowly getting everybody's feedback, which is totally fine with me. I just want to say it may not be a lecture and then Q&A. It may be like an ongoing, conversation, in detail of point by point. Does that make sense to everyone?
Makes sense to me. Thanks.
Cool. Yep. So basically, in terms of guiding principle, preventing significant unnecessary harm is like, making murder illegal, and, preventing people from robbing and stealing, and, the basic laws that have been around for a couple thousand years. But in general, I generically refer to that as causing significant amounts of unnecessary harm. And then beyond that, I think that we should maximize what I call net present happiness while minimizing net present harm, which means take the lifetime of the individuals that can be influenced by a decision, and you want to increase the happiness over the span of a lifetime with a discounting rate for future, because there's an uncertainty there. And so a discounting rate just means that, the same amount of happiness in the future is not worth as much as the same amount of happiness now. But basically where we're trying to increase the overall net amount of happiness while decreasing the net amount of harm. And so for me, that's what I consider to be fair. And someone added any person, animal, and the environment. And I agree with that. I think that it's more contentious, and I intentionally didn't go there because, including animals in that is a whole debate in and of itself. It's okay. You're welcome to leave it, actually. I personally subscribe to that. I just didn't include it because I think it was like, we could have a whole conversation around whether or not, animals' rights is important. And, there only a small percentage of people are vegetarians. So clearly the majority, thinks that eating animals is okay. And I still eat animals, even though I think that it's unethical, and that's another story. So I just haven't been able to give it up. So that said, do as I say, not as I do. Then last is that I think that if a policy or law doesn't do those two things, then I'd argue that it probably shouldn't be a policy or law. And basically, I'm hoping that we can agree that those are reasonably good guiding principles, given that this is a contentious subject, and we don't want to debate all night. But if there's anyone that has a clear reason that that's a bad paradigm, like, feel free to present it. And if not, I'm going to suggest we use that as like a general, knowing that there is a lot of subjectivism and sort of interpretation in those guiding principles, that we at least use them as guiding principles when we're talking about the things that we talk about this evening, if that makes sense. All right, so I waited apparently you're supposed to wait 2 seconds to see if anyone disagrees. And so I waited 2 seconds. So I'm gonna assume that we're good with those guiding principles. Now I'm gonna talk about, and this is Hussein, who I don't think is here tonight, but I'm gonna give him credit for always reminding me to do definitions. And I'm gonna talk about the definition of what an economic system encompasses. It's production, resource allocation, which I include like how taxes are spent. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about healthcare and education, and then distribution of goods and services. Someone included work, sounds good to me. And then types of organizations, and then someone included limits on size, domains, countries that they may participate in. Happy to discuss that and debate that. That's an interesting subject where I part ways with politicians that I usually agree with. And then there are really 4 economic problems that an economic system is supposed to solve, which is the kinds and quantities of goods that are produced, how goods should be produced, how the output will be distributed, and when to produce. And for those things, I'm basically going to propose capitalism is very good, and I'm going to try to make an argument for the reasons that capitalism is good compared to like most of the other paradigms are like a centrally controlled system for deciding these things. And I'd argue centrally controlled systems generally, to sort of shoot a hole in the opposition for a centrally controlled system, is often slow to respond and is not as innovative often as the free markets will be. And so that's what I like about capitalism. And it's not as empowering in that you can't just be an entrepreneur and say, I'm going to invent a new way of solving a really important problem and then make a bunch of money and solve that problem better than anyone else. Because it's more centrally controlled. And so that's what I like about capitalism. There's a lot of flaws in capitalism in the way that it's implemented today, and I'm gonna shoot holes in capitalism as well and then try to patch those holes up. The limitations of capitalism for me is that, and I would argue that those flaws of capitalism have created a lot of anti-capitalists and created a lot of momentum around other economic paradigms. And so rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater is what I would consider throwing capitalism out, because capitalism has done a lot of good since it was invented. And like, I think it was Birth of Nations, Adam Smith, if I remember right, that was the beginning of capitalism. And anyway, I might be wrong about that, but that's my recollection. So no, it was Adam Smith. Anyway, but basically, I want to talk about how the faults can be addressed through coordination and cooperation between free market enterprises and government, and about what are the limitations of capitalism, where does it cause injustice or lack of fairness, as we defined it above, and then talk about how we can leverage the benefits of capitalism in order to create a more fair society. And then so the pros of capitalism are that, it produces high quality goods given the price, high quality, low cost goods pretty efficiently, because you have a lot of innovation, you have a lot of competition creating innovation. And so, different competing companies, create higher quality, lower cost products until the consumer gets a better outcome. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't want to nitpick, but this point seems pretty important to me, that when you are saying that capitalism is a good but a flawed system, and you sort of imply that there could be some better system if we are talking about benefits and downsides to capitalism. But so two problems with this. Capitalism is the only system that we know that works, because any just somewhat successful economies are capitalist, or they are mixed economies, you could say, but mixed economies are still capitalist. And a second point is that there is no such thing as a pure capitalist, because even if we are talking about a market economy that is a part of some mixed system, but markets never operate in a vacuum. So there are always some government rules, regulations that define what is allowed, what is not allowed. And without this, without legal system, without the system of contracts and so on, markets just, they cannot work.
Yeah, so Michael, sorry, were you done?
Yeah. So I guess maybe we have to rephrase this question. It's not about like alternatives to capitalism, but there are different variants of capitalist systems, and some of them work better, some of them have more problems, others have less problems. So it's a choice between the different variants within the capitalist system.
But there are alternatives to capitalism. Capitalism has only existed for a couple hundred years. Now, I would argue that capitalism is better than all the alternatives, and that's why I'm starting with capitalism. And if someone tonight wants to make an argument that something other than capitalism is a better starting point, they're welcome to make that point. But I agree with you, Michael. I think capitalism is the de facto winner in terms of capitalism versus its alternatives. And so what we're talking about, what I'm going to present is how to modify capitalism and what regulations are common sense regulations that will make capitalism better than the capitalism we experience today. And I agree with you that there is no currently implemented quote unquote pure capitalism that has no regulations. Some people wish that it existed and they can go off and create a country where it does and see how it works out for them. I don't think it would work out very well personally. I'm not going to propose that that's what we should do. On the contrary, I'm going to propose something else. So everything you're saying, I agree with, Michael, and that's what we're talking about tonight.
Or at least maybe we have to be more accurate with terminology and define what do we mean under capitalism. Because, for instance, Chinese system, which is like a mixed system, do we still consider it as a capitalist, or it's some intermediate variant? So you can argue both ways, I guess, but maybe we have to clarify.
Maybe, Michael, if I present something that you feel like is ambiguous, then feel free to point out what you think is the ambiguity. Is that fair?
Okay. All right.
Okay. So basically, capitalism in general, I think, creates high quality goods at a low quality price because of the competition. It enables entrepreneurship, which lets people start their own businesses and lets them create their own destiny. That allows this sort of creative destruction where you have new companies be able to take market share from old companies because they're more innovative, they have a better culture. And basically what it allows is for the most successful players to win in the free markets. And the question is, what does it mean to be the most successful, and what rules are the different players in those free markets playing by? And that's the crux of what we're going to talk about tonight, because I would argue the rules are the important part, not whether or not there are people competing with each other, which I think makes a lot of sense. And that's what capitalism is about, is having a lot of companies compete with each other, although we'll touch on monopolies where no one's competing at all, or where there's very little competition, I should argue. But we're going to talk about all that. That said, I do think that there's a value in protecting novel inventions, because if every new idea can be stolen by a big company that just sees a small company come up with a better innovation and just copies it and steals it, then you don't get as much innovation, because people aren't going to invest in expensive innovations, especially, and people who create innovations are not going to be rewarded and then be able to control more capital because they were the most innovative. And so I think that there is a value to intellectual property rights being protected. And so I'm going to argue that that's important, but I also think that they shouldn't be protected for so long that you stifle innovation. And a lot of what we talk about tonight is we're not going to come up with patents should only be allowed for 15 years or 20 years and debate whether it should be 15 or 20. That's not where I want to go. I'd rather talk about here's the upside of something and here's the downside, and we know that there needs to be a balance between those things, and we can talk about how, you know, generally important those sides are. But I don't want to get mired in like patents should last for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, because that, you know, I don't think is a good use of our time. It's too detail oriented, and none of us are policymakers that have all the data to make those decisions. So I just want to talk about what makes something good or bad, and how good and how bad in general terms. And so I would say setting up supply and demand markets creates resiliency and a mutually agreed upon price, because in a free market system, you know, the buyer and seller have to agree on the price essentially, as long as there's competition. And that's part of the beauty of capitalism and free markets. And so that self-adjusts the price based on demand and supply and demand economics. For those of us that have taken economics, and for those that haven't, if that's confusing, let me know and I can try to give a basic overview. And then it rewards people providing the best service at the best price, and that creates better services at better prices in the long run, which ultimately helps the consumer and uses innovation to help the consumer in the long run, as long as there is that competition that keeps things sort of progressively improving in that market. And prices are set and agreed upon by individuals. The good part about that is that the people who are naturally more successful gain more wealth and therefore gain more influence in those markets. And in some respects, the people who are more successful are the ones you want commanding more capital, because they will use that capital to create a better return on capital. And what that does is it's called making the pie bigger, right? If you make the economy bigger, like if you look at some very interesting statistics in the Roman Empire, and I'm going to paraphrase these, I might get the numbers a little bit wrong, but I'm going to end up publishing these in the Freethinker Institute, because one of the goals of the Freethinker Institute is to create a world where everybody makes enough money that money no longer buys happiness, which is a disputed metric in the first place. But one study came out saying $75,000 a year is enough money that money no longer buys happiness. Well, in the Roman Empire, people made in modern USA dollars about $500 a year. In 1900, it was about $5,000 a year in the US. Currently in the US, it's about $56,000 a year. So think 100 years from now, like, you know, it's probably going to be at least $560,000 a year in modern USA dollars. So now you're talking about there's enough money that everybody should be able to make $75,000 a year, or things are a little bit, you know, unethical. And so, you know, just putting in place that there is this sort of long-term economic growth of making the pie bigger is what I was starting from. And so the economy has grown in terms of efficiency and productivity so much that modern, you know, production in farming and, you know, industry, and, you know, people used to make shoes by hand and now they're done by factory. And so it's so much more efficient that we can build, you know, more products with less money. And that's why economic wealth has increased so much over the last 2,000 years, and probably more even beyond that. I didn't go further back than the Roman Empire. Thought that was good enough. To prove the trend. So that said, I think that you know, and thank you for correcting my terrible spelling. That's I have horrible spelling, so thank you for that, Michael. So you know, some laissez-faire capitalists would say there should be no regulations, but I would argue that it's very easy for companies, and you can look at examples of like, you know, it's pretty well documented not to knock them, because I have friends that work for them, and I think that they do many good things, and I'm not trying to knock them as a company. But if you look at, you know, Goldman Sachs in the 2008 crisis, they sold their customers, you know, assets that they knew were going to tank in value. And they basically offloaded assets to their customers that lost their customers huge amounts of money. And in doing so, made themselves lots of money. But if you look at them, they're still a huge powerhouse in the financial services industry with a lot of really smart people working for them. And they haven't really suffered that much economically for it. So you can't really, it's a little hard, and that's just cherry picking one example, but I think you could come up with quite a few examples of companies that do unethical things that really don't go bankrupt, suffer major consequences. So you can't say the free markets are always like, penalizing companies who do unethical stuff. So what I would argue is there should be laws that penalize causing unnecessary harm. Thank you, Scott. I did say I have terrible spelling. So I had to read a dictionary just to get into my college because my verbal SAT score was so bad. So that's what I would say, is that there should be common sense regulation, and the two guidelines that I mentioned before is what I think should guide the common sense regulations, which are, stiff penalties preventing causing unnecessary harm, where you're like poisoning a water supply that kills people. There should be really strict regulations for stopping companies from doing that, or if they do it, they should pay so much money that no company would ever want to do that again, basically. And then we should aim to incentivize companies to increase net present happiness and decrease net present harm. Imagine if every law was actually focused on doing that. Imagine how much better of a world we would live in if we didn't have all of these like corporate cronyism. Like I implemented systems that saved, I won't say the company's name, but one of my companies, many millions of dollars a year because of, a law that was passed by lobbying that was only implementable by huge corporations. And, basically it was corporate cronyism, and they passed a law that would benefit big corporations. And so we implemented a project and I inherited it and I had to implement it. I didn't like it, but I did. That kind of thing, doesn't increase competition. It actually decreases competition, which decreases the amount of harm in society, or it decreases the amount of happiness in society and increases harm. So I would argue that, there should be an attempt at net zeroing positive and negatives. And so the example I like to give is cigarettes, right? Cigarettes cause increased health risks. And, in the US, at least, there's a law that if someone is at risk of death, they automatically get health care. Now, I would argue that there should be longer term healthcare and more preventative healthcare provided to citizens as well, which I'll argue later on. But basically, what I would say is that all of the health implications of let's say that cigarettes cost $1 billion worth of health, damages every year, then I would argue that the taxes on cigarettes should raise $1 billion every year in funds. And then we should use those $1 billion raised to pay for the health implications of the people who smoke cigarettes. And in doing so, we actually create a tax that, increases, that basically leaves us net neutral from someone doing something that might cause themselves harm. They're basically paying for their own healthcare in some respects, for the thing that they do that causes their own body harm. And so that's the kind of paradigm that I want to propose, to me makes sense. And if anyone disagrees with this stuff, feel free to jump in. Limitations on the free market. So what does it not do? So there's no guaranteed social safety net. And what I'm going to do is give an extreme example is let's say you're born with a genetic defect that, and I don't even like to use the example of someone that's blind, because one of the best SQL developers I worked with in my life was blind. The guy was brilliant. He was faster than the people that weren't blind. And so, even people with debilitating situations now, can be very productive, but certain medical situations leave someone in a situation where they may not be very able to work. And in those situations, I don't think that it would be very humane as society to leave that person to only be able to survive based on voluntary charity. And if there's not enough voluntary charity, then they basically they're going to die, right? Because there's no one to feed them and no one to give them food and shelter. And so I think there should be some sort of social safety net. There are a couple of different solutions for this. There's something called the mutual aid society, which is voluntary charity where people come together to sort of support and create like an insurance system to support members of the mutual aid society. I personally like a different solution, which is taxing and creating social services, which includes for me, like I like in the situation of people with disabilities that prevent them from working. I think that people should have coverage, and that's how the U.S. works today. Is there is the ability to get food stamps and stuff like that to survive if you can't have a job. However, I have an alternative to welfare, which is what I think something that was implemented that my grandfather told me about in World War II, or in the Depression, sorry, was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what it was is there were so many unemployed people in the Depression that what the government did is they hired people to just build parks and to build trails in parks and stuff like that. And so the government was basically like an employer of last resort. And I think that's a good alternative to welfare, quite frankly, because a lot of people get very incentivized, like angry at the idea of people getting paid for not working. And I kind of get that, because those people that are angry are working really hard themselves and sometimes making not that much more than the people on welfare who are, then characterized as watching TV all day and not working. I think that instead we should have government be an employer of last resort. I personally think that it would be better to be privately implemented and government funded, because I think government isn't super good at job training skills and the types of things that private employers are generally better at. I'm sure that's very debatable, and I'm happy to debate it tonight. But that's what I'm going to propose. And then for those with kids, I think that there should be either a work from home option or childcare should be provided so that that person can work in order to make the living. I think that those jobs should pay reasonably poorly, like minimum wage type of payment, because they should want to get the job training skills to get a higher paid job and not stay on the employer of last resort indefinitely paradigm. So that said, I also think there should be some sort of government funded healthcare. And again, and I've held a couple of meetups on healthcare, and basically the place that I landed after talking about this quite a bit is that I think there should be a government funded but privately implemented healthcare solution that makes sure, and there are a couple of options. One is single payer solution, which is similar to what Europe and Canada have. There are a lot of different, we're not going to have time to go into like all of the details of healthcare. It's very complicated and highly contentious. A lot of this stuff is, so that's one possibility as a single payer solution. But I think that government funded and privately implemented solution could be, if you had good companies working in the right way, could be less expensive and more effective than even socialized medicine. I don't want to like delve into like all of those options in detail, because like I said, like healthcare is its own, we could do another night on healthcare. Universal basic income is a good one, Michael, to talk about. And I guess, I am kind of against universal basic income for the reasons that I mentioned, is that, I think that the government should be an employer of last resort rather than, handing out money for not doing anything. I think that, money should be earned in general. And, I like a meritocracy. And for me, a meritocracy means the more value you add, the more money that you make. And so for me, universal basic income is not that. It's just giving out money, to be a member of society, which you can do if you're ultra wealthy. And like maybe 100 years from now, when, the average per capita income is $560,000 per person, we can offer a universal basic income of $50,000 a year and no problem. And maybe that doesn't hurt us. But today, even if we took all the money of trillionaires and billionaires, we still wouldn't, and divided it up equally amongst all Americans, we still would be at, $56,000 a year of income, which is the average per capita income in the US. And so we wouldn't have enough money. That money doesn't buy happiness, according to that one study that said that was the case. So, Susan.
So I added a question mark at the end. But
Okay.
at some point, I believe we will have to consider it.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea at some point. Like at some point, I would love some sort of universal basic income. And so we talked about like aspirationally, I think it's a great thing to aspire towards, but it should come when we don't need everybody to be productive. Like right now, we're not at that point where we have so much money in society that money is not a scarce resource. When we get to the point that money is no longer a scarce resource, which may not be 100 years from now, although it may be 200 years from now, but at some point money won't be a scarce resource and people will be able to work sort of optionally, and having a universal basic income would be great. And then Shaunak.
I just want to point out one policy that had actually been implemented in a city in South Korea, that it's not really universal basic income, but I believe it has the potential to, have benefit. It's kind of a handout, but with some caveats to it. The thing is, they started giving out a small amount of money during the tough times to all the people in the city. But the thing is, you can only spend that money back into the city, small businesses only, and not to franchises or like McDonald's or anything. So more like, more like mom and pop shops, or, stalls or whatnot, something like that, where it's trackable. And so it's kind of possible in South Korea. You have to understand that in what kind of places this system is possible or not. So what it actually did is, you giving out the money, you just don't want to give out money to people because they'll use it the way they want it. And who knows, they might want, if you give out $1,000, they'll probably get something. And this actually happens. They'll probably spend it on something that they don't need, instead of putting the money back into the economy, which the South Korean policy actually did. And it really helped them a lot. So it's like, if you're going to give out money, there has to be some caveats with it. Obviously, how you're going to control those caveats is very important. It's just like people give out food stamps in the US. So what you'll see is many of these places, these food stamps people, they go to these a bodega or something. So you give them the $50 food stamp, they get $25 back in cash. The shopkeeper gets to make a $25 profit, but most poor people who are addicted on the streets, they'll use that $25 on booze and whatnot. And this is, this actually happens. So
yeah. And I think that's exactly why I think people should work for their money and
exactly
be able to spend it on what they want, quite frankly, because then it's a free market decision. They have a scarce resource that they earn and they can spend it on what they want. And if they want to spend it on booze, then they eat rice, right? And if they want to spend it on steak, they can buy steak. And so it's a personal decision. With that said, Susan, and I think it's not Susan, but your name says Susan, and I'm not going to remember what your name was.
No, that's correct.
Okay.
Or can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Know, can you? Okay, great. So I really am an advocate of a guaranteed basic income. And I think that there's a lot of issues with it. There's a lot of problems with it. But the basic thing is they shouldn't be reined in on how they can spend it. They should spend it the way they feel like spending it. And if it's on drugs and alcohol for the first couple of months, they're going to know that they're going to be out of luck if there are no other resources and services. So they have to learn this. I believe this. And after 2 months of spending all of their $1,000 or whatever on drugs, they're going to know they're going to have to get their act together. And I think that that's really important. A, B, one of the problems I think we have is that in the major cities where we're experiencing huge homelessness, like mine in Seattle, is that people gather where there are resources, where there are food banks. And if there are no food banks and they have to rely on the guaranteed basic income, they're going to go to Wyoming. They're going to go to, wherever there is a lesser cost of living and become potentially great members of society. And there's an impetus, a reason to better their guaranteed basic income. They can be like everyone else, but they can still eat and they can still have a roof over their head while they're getting their life together.
Great, thanks, Susan. I just documented both perspectives where Shaunak said people may make poor decisions, and so we should choose what they can spend it on. And Susan said people should be able to choose because they'll learn from their mistakes. And I think those are both good points, and people are welcome to add on to one or the other if they want, but I want to let Michael go next.
Could I ask Susan really quick if everybody's going to be, would you recommend that people be sort of eased into this process sort of in groups? If everybody's going to have a kind of learning curve to having this basic income, maybe that would help reduce, I mean, maybe we don't want the entire nation being drunk and high for 2 months at a time. Maybe we want just small pockets kind of getting used to this at a time and then ease the nation into it bit by bit.
It'll be the 60s all over again, my friend.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that needs to be part of it. It's got to be a well thought out thing, and it has to happen gradually because you're not going to shut the doors to a food bank, all the food banks in the major cities. But I think if you ease it out gently, you let them know what's going to happen, you let them know what's going to come, what's happening, then, maybe they won't have to live in the middle of downtown Seattle, and maybe they will move to the outer skirts, the more agrarian parts of the state or other states where there is work that they can do, and they don't have to worry about food. You don't have to worry about shelter because they have this guaranteed basic income that they will not die.
So just to be clear, I don't think any of the proposals of universal basic income, at least the ones that I've heard about, will actually prevent people from needing to work at all. I don't think we have enough money as society to provide that kind of universal basic income. I think it was like a supplemental thing, unless I'm mistaken.
No, I disagree. I think the word basic is basic. It's enough to allow someone to survive. That's all. It's not sitting back and watching TV because you know what? You probably can't afford a TV, but you can survive and you're not in a tent on the street.
Right. Yeah, I guess, and that's where I was proposing that I think people should be able to have a job where they can make that kind of money rather than just get it. But that, I get there's different opinions, and you feel like it should just be given. Michael.
Well, the reason is that it allows people to better their life. So I don't want to live on $1,000 a month, but I can survive, and I can shower, and I can be savvy enough to go get a job and better my life. I'm still going to get my $1,000 a month, but if I get a job at Amazon, now I get $4,000 a month.
Right, but you can actually do that even better if you're getting job training in a working environment, right? If you're working for an employer of last resort and you're learning valuable job training skills on the job in order to make your earn your universal basic income, you're learning the skills as you earn that money. You're adding value to the economy at the same time, and you're learning skills to get a higher paid job. So for me, that's like a bunch of benefits over just giving someone a universal basic income, which if someone had a universal basic income, let's be honest, some people, and not everybody, Susan, but some people aren't going to use it to better themselves. They're just going to say the bare amount, I'm just going to survive, and they're going to save up for a TV and eat rice for a couple of months and then have a TV and then, just have a TV and watch TV all day.
Yep. And you know what? That's okay. Because that elements of society will not be on the streets. But the people who will take a leg up will have encouragement and will have the ability to take a flippant shower so that they can apply for a job.
Right.
But there's going to be that element.
They won't be on the streets with either one of our examples, right? Because with my example, they would be working for the employer of last resort. And so they won't be on the street in either one. Now, they are on the streets today, but given our current paradigm, but I don't think with either one of ours that they would be. Alia, papi está trabajando frente a eso. Sorry. I just want to clarify, and again, Susan, not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I see it differently, and just explaining why. But Michael, let me let you go.
Just a quick comment on the same topic. First, I don't see a contradiction between the idea of this employer of last resort and job training. I like this idea actually, but I don't think that it is incompatible with some sort of universal basic income.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not. I agree with you, Michael. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And the second point is that in Mountain View, where I live, our city council just a few days ago, they approved a program that they called not universal, but guaranteed basic income. So it is universal in the sense that there are no strings attached in how people can use this money. But there are some qualification requirements, and there is a lottery, so it's not for everyone. So it's a limited program. But a part of this program is to collect the data, how it works,
Right.
for those people who participate. And these things are tried at different places, and it's not a pipe dream anymore. So people are exploring this, and maybe in some form something will be found viable.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Trevor.
I'm thinking that if we're gonna start getting into things like universal basic income, wouldn't it make sense to kind of start from like fundamental first principles, like consider whether the design of our overall societies are even remotely optimal to start off with? Like, for example, if you look at cities that are building low-income housing, very often the cost for one unit to house one person is going to be in the range of, depending on what city you're in, 250,000 to $750,000 to house one person. This is clearly insane, and yet this is how we run our country. Shouldn't we be looking at first principles?
So so when you say first principles, that's not to me a first principle, and so I'm not sure when you're defining first principles what you mean by first principles. You gave an example.
How about we live in communes as an option, where each person gets like a university dorm, where each person gets a tiny room there, and then you share everything else. Perhaps there's food cooked for you, so you do away with the income itself, and you ensure that it instead use that income to deliver the end product with maximum efficiency, right? So instead of giving $1,000 to someone who doesn't know how to spend money, why don't you give them $500 of hyper efficient products, which is a room and food and some facilities to use, and then a bit of spending money, and then who knows what else. Like, we don't even consider whether the design of our society is efficient in the first place. It's not even on our radar, demonstrating how stupid our leadership is and how stupid our society has become, that we don't even think about things like this.
So
it's not even on our radar.
If I can, Trevor, I'm just going to suggest like staying away from language of calling any ideas or even people who hold them like dumb or stupid, only because we want to keep an open mind towards everything. And by vilifying people who hold a certain idea as stupid, we immediately discount whether or not we want to consider that because of emotional reasons. So let's just try to use like, language more like seems like a very bad idea to me, or like this is the reason that I disagree with that idea. Maybe give our reasons for agreeing with something or disagreeing with something.
I understand your point, but at the same time,
but I agree with
it's lying to ourselves an optimal way to behave when performing system analysis.
And Trevor, I want to say I agree with your idea, which is that we often, and we're going to have another conversation about this. I don't know when it's going to come up, but it's going to be about things that we take as assumptions. And there are a lot of things that, we as people, like for those of us in America, for example, whatever country we're from, there are a lot of things that we take as assumptions because we live in our country and grew up in it. And then if you move to another country, which I lived in Spain for a year, a lot of the things that I assumed as an American were true people in Spain assumed completely the opposite and just a completely different paradigm. And so I think your point about challenging the norms, Trevor, is a good one. And I like that you're being visionary in your approach. So, Shaunak, go ahead.
Yeah, I have another point, but just in response to Trevor for a moment, it's just also you would. I mean, I completely as agree with you with the fact that maybe it is actually much more beneficial to live in a commune. But then again, there's the point about how many people actually would want to live in a commune. It's the decision they make, right? Technically, after they live in a commune, they would decide, they'll realize it's better. But it's again, in the end, it would be back to the decision of the person how they want to spend their money. Nonetheless, another logical fallacy that I see with the universal basic income thing, the point that it is universal, that means everybody should get it. So even a poor person and even a rich person should get it. So you're basically putting in a lot of money into people's hand once again, and basically putting in a whole lot of money into the economy. Now, the thing is, this creates much more cash into the economy, and everybody has this money. But what happens is when you put in so much more money, basic economics, inflation happens, and that 1,000, let's say, is not worth anymore, or it has reduced value in the economy. So what happens next? The people will start saying that you need to increase the universal basic economy. 1,000 is not enough anymore. So that's a logical problem there in that whole system in itself. So just wanted to point that out as well. So yeah,
I think the part that I hone in on what you said, Shaunak, and this has always bothered me about universal basic income, is that you're also giving it to people who are millionaires and billionaires. And given it's not making a big dent, but why bother giving it to them in the first place, right? Like, why are we spending tax dollars to give money to those people when really it adds no, when we talk about increasing happiness and decreasing harm, if the study that $80,000, $75,000 a year is, the most amount of money that is needed where money doesn't buy happiness anymore, everybody you give that universal basic income to that's already making $75,000 a year or more, you're not increasing happiness for them. And you are potentially taking happiness away from people who are making less than that you could be giving more money to. So that said, I want to let Remco go.
Yeah, look, I'd like to add directly to the conversation, but I do have a little bit of a problem. I just find that we're getting trapped into some of the detail and oversighting the bigger picture. Garrett, you wrote a great paper, and I'm just being introduced to it right now, and I went right back to your guiding principles. And I think, from my view, I think we needed to have discussed those guiding principles right on the outset and made sure that we're all on the same song sheet, because otherwise I think we can get lost in the detail. What really are we about? What do you think is wrong with the system? I'm sorry, I just needed to express that. And so I spent a little bit of time. I wrote down 8 points that I don't know what is the right location. I didn't have time to think about it. But, I wrote 8 points right at the outset. And I think, until we agree to that, I think we're going to get lost in the detail. We're going to have sparring sessions about one thing over another, whether a UBI is appropriate, a whole lot of things. So, yeah, I wish I could have tuned in a bit earlier and said, Garrett, hey, hang on, mate, slow down a little bit. Let's see if we could get the guiding principles right. Because for my feeling, and I'm passionate about this, that what has happened, particularly in my part of the world, we are confusing the country for the people. And the whole discussion about economics is about the benefit to the country. And once you wake up to that, a lot of the economics starts to take on a different priority when you say, hey, I am the country, I am the shareholder, what is the benefit to me? And when you start thinking like that, a whole lot of things that are being raised will start to disappear. You say, yeah, that stimulates the country. For example, immigration, as one classic example. I live in a high immigration country like you do, and it's used as an economic stimulant. Well, actually dilute shareholder value. Anyway, so I'm sorry if I'm rambling on a bit, but I'm just trying to encourage us to think whether we're on the right track.
Yeah, I hear you, Remco. I read through your principles. I am just afraid if we go up to them, we're going to debate those for the rest of the time. So, you know, I think that, and the reason that I started with the principles is that, you know, for me, increasing happiness and decreasing harm is a pretty agreeable thing that I think doesn't take a lot of time to debate, but gives us a guiding principle. And preventing significant amounts of unnecessary harm is similarly agreeable and doesn't provide a lot of like debate, but they both do actually provide a lot of direction and a paradigm under which we can judge each one of these policies. And that's why I brought back like Shaunik's point about like, you know, if you're giving universal basic income to millionaires, then you're not actually increasing happiness at all by giving a millionaire $1,000 extra a month. And yet, you know, you are spending money and taxpayer dollars on that. So is that, you know, does it make sense for it to be universal basic income, or should it be a, you know, a basic income for people making less than $75,000 a year, which to me would make more sense. And that's like a way of using our guiding principles to sort of, I think, move the conversation forward about that particular issue. Although I don't want to get too hung up on universal basic income. I think we've heard different opinions of like pro and con and like back and forth. And so I want to like keep moving on because we're, you know, 45 minutes left and on page 6 of 9 now. So let's, if we can, just keep moving forward, if that makes sense. So, you know, I want to sort of recognize that capitalism doesn't make a, you know, a fair or level playing field. And basically, you know, what I call a level playing field is where everybody has an equal opportunity, regardless of factors outside of their control, like genetic defects, being born into a poor family versus a wealthy family. And it does not mean economic equality for everybody, because natural talent and hard work should be, in my opinion, rewarded in some way. It just means everybody's starting from a place of equal opportunity to things like education. And then the harder you work and the smarter you are, the more successful you are, and the more capital you control, and the more influence you have in society. And I see those as being a meritocracy, and a meritocracy as a positive thing. Michael, did you still have your hand up from before, or did you have a question?
Actually, I forgot to lower it, but I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Just responding on these ideas like this communes and all these different arrangements. So one advantage of call it capitalist system, call it democratic system, whatever we have now, is that it allows for all these many different experiments. If you want to have a co-op, you can have a co-op. If you want to live in a commune, you can live in a commune. Maybe you will not have automatically economic advantages over other forms of business organization, but you can do this. And so we can have this competition and experiment. So just a quick point that I want.
That's a great point, Michael, and I'm glad you're making it. I meant to make it earlier and I missed it, so I'm really glad you are. Is, you know, the Amish have communes, right, in some respects, right? So we have communes in the US, and so we can have communes in capitalism. And I think, like Michael said, that's one of the beauties of capitalism is you can have any structure in capitalism. You can have socialist structures in some respects. You can have like Mondragon in Spain within capitalism, right? A worker-owned company, and capitalism allows for worker-owned companies. You know, capitalism allows for all different structures within it, which is like a really great level of flexibility, in my opinion, that you don't get in the other paradigms, which kind of is like a one size fits all paradigm. And that's part of why I naturally gravitate towards capitalism, is it allows all of the different paradigms to compete with each other rather than saying we're only going to do it one way. That said, I want to talk about education in the US, education is funded by, like, K through 12 education is funded by property taxes, which means if you're born into a poor area, then you basically don't get nearly as good of a quality education as people who are from wealthier areas. And I don't see that as a level playing field. And so I think that there's always going to be, the ability to send kids to private school, and, money will always buy some level of education. But to me, there should be a bare minimum of like public education should be of a certain level of quality, even if you're born into a poor neighborhood. And so I would like to see, tax funds be used to equally fund schools from all different areas, with the understanding that, the PTAs in the wealthier areas are going to be stronger PTAs. Let's face it, like, the parents are more hands-on, and, me and my wife are probably going to be more hands-on with my kids than, a lot of inner cities are in, with their kids, even if they were funded the same. But let's at least do what we can to level the playing field as much as we can, and give kids from poorer neighborhoods like a fighting chance, so that they don't have like not enough money to buy textbooks, right? Although now everything's digital, but like when I was a kid, like inner city schools didn't have textbooks. And so, they were struggling to teach kids anything. And, I think that that would be a step forward. And I would even go further and say that higher education should be free as well, because it's really an investment in the education of the population. And, saddling kids with a huge amount of college debt is, in some respects, very antithetical to innovation, because you take people who are young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, college graduates that might want to be like 5 years out of college and have saved up some money to start a company, but they can't because, they need to spend their money on, they need to have a stable income to be able to be paying off their student loans. And so I think that higher education is really an investment in the population. And so I think that higher education should be free. And, I realize that's a controversial and politically loaded topic. And that said, Michael, you have your hands up.
Yeah, so regarding that education should be funded nationally, ideally, yes. Moreover, I would say that we should have at least a strong national component in curricula for K-12 education. But at the same time, how could you prevent these local authorities from like additional funding? Because they have the freedom to establish some local taxes or something, and to spend it for anything, including education. And this is what happens. So it's not that just schools are underfunded in this poor neighborhoods, but they are underfunded compared to other more richer neighborhoods that provide more funding for their schools.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that having standards of education, and there are so many books being banned, in like that, basically, like it's a difficult problem, but like I think that there should be a lot. Education is probably something we should do a separate topic on, because there's so much to talk about around education. And in fact, I have another paper on education in general. And so maybe let's not get too into the weeds in education, but to say, yes, I agree with you, Michael, and anyone that disagrees is welcome to, but I agree with you that it would be good to have, standards, and there are supposed to be national standards of what's taught across the country, as I understand it. Education, let me just leave it at education is complicated, and let's save all the details of education for another night, if that's okay. And people are still welcome to comment, but go ahead.
I agree, but there is also the issue, which is it's usually related to education, but it's a more general issue. That how could you prevent people, or in this case, for instance, parents, from giving something to their kids extra, if they have a choice if they have money, if they have time, whatever. Homeschooled children and so on. In free society we allow this, but it could be seen as unfair compared to other people who don't.
We're gonna get into estate tax. I have a very extreme perspective on estate tax, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll get there. And I really like what Remco is writing about education needs to be reviewed from the 1830s industrial model. Like our educational system is outdated. In fact, 1830s is not even like our, lecture halls go back to like medieval institutions, literally like medieval institutions. Like we are living in like the world of the information age, and there are innovative educational paradigms out there. And I think even those pale in comparison to what is going to be possible in the next, 20, 50, or even, looking as far out as 100 years from now. I think education is going to be drastically different in the future. And I hope to be a part of that at some point in my life. And again, I'm going to suggest that we pause on education without going into too much detail, because I want to stay on economics, because that was the topic for tonight. But I did want to touch on education because I think education as it relates to economics, I wanted to touch on, but not get into the details or the weeds of education, if that makes sense. If that's a fair like middle ground to, just not get like totally tangented off onto education. So I want to talk a little bit about monopolies. This is a controversial subject. I plan to write a paper on monopolies, and basically, monopolies create like a huge force, like put a lot of power in the hands of the monopoly, huge economic force because they're making so much money, a huge, ability to affect price. They can kind of charge whatever they want because they're the only game in town. And whatever they want can be really high when there's no competition. And then as soon as competition comes up, they can drop their prices so low, like people did in the railroad days. If I remember right, it was the railroads. Maybe it was oil. No, it may have been oil, where some of the Rockefeller's days, they basically like undercut price to like bankrupt competition to be able to retain their monopolies or oligopolies. And so a lot of those techniques have been used, over the last century, and will continue to be used as long as monopolies aren't broken up. And there is an argument from Bork, which has been, since I think it was the 80s, like we haven't really broken up any monopolies since the Bell. Maybe I'm remembering the last one wrong, but we haven't been breaking up monopolies very much recently because of Bork's arguments. And that's what my paper is going to be about, is kind of debunking his arguments. But that said, I do think that it's important to have competition, because competition is what creates what we talked about before, which is progress in terms of lower prices and better quality products through the competition of the free markets. And that's one of the beauties of capitalism. The ironic part is that capitalism tends to lead to monopolies because you get one winner that is the clear winner who decides to take all, and then they use their force to like maintain their position by increasing and decreasing prices to maintain dominance. And that's a very harmful thing to the consumer at the end of the day, in my opinion. And this is what I plan to write about in the argument debunking Bork. And so I would argue that we should be breaking up monopolies and, at least making sure that there are 3 to 4 competitors in each space that have some reasonable sense of market share. If you look at the web browser market, Google has 80% of the web browser market roughly. Search is, probably similar on google.com. Google Analytics, which by the way tracks all your web browsing activity, no matter what you want. They're tracking it behind the scenes on the web browser.
Can you just state why? Can you, you're making, you just, I just need to hear what your argument is. Because it's not very clear that, except in extraordinary circumstances for a very short period of times, anybody gets any kind of monopoly whatsoever. So I just like, give us some examples of what's really a monopoly.
So that's what I was doing when you started talking. I was explaining that Google search is more or less a monopoly, right? Google has a vast majority of the search engine marketplace. Now, there are other searches, right? There's Bing, but who uses Bing? Like almost no one uses Bing. There's a couple of other search engines, but their market share is so negligible that the market forces are really dominated by Google and search. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I do, because Bing has what, less than 10% of the market or whatever. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's my primary engine because it's less search biased. So I mean, it's not a. I mean, there's no institution or anything putting that in place. It's for all intents and purposes a free service. So I'm just understanding what's monopolistic here in this particular case. I mean, I'm trying to think of something that's a monopoly that we have, and I actually can't. I can't think of any.
Well, there is
Yeah.
one company, but it's Intel has monopoly over their chips, but it's quality of the product. You cannot break down Intel.
Well, Intel's dying now. Intel's in deep trouble now.
You. Let me finish. I agree with you. Google is not monopoly. There's other choices. It's people's decision because they provide better service.
Yes.
People, but that's how it is. What you can do with Google? Stop people from using Google? Like, what can you do about that? It's not practical.
So everybody knows how to make Google go away. The problem is that in doing so, there's no economic incentive in doing it. The reason you make Google go away is you remove the ads. The problem is, we'd have to make it a state institution.
So just to maybe we should look up the definition of a monopoly.
Another thing that I would want to point out is it's kind of a tendency in the economy itself, not monopoly necessary, but duopolies kind of naturally come up time and time again. And I would say there's an issue with duopolies also, and it's kind of a cartel kind of environment.
Correct.
And a monopoly is a dominant position of an industry by one company. And so I think it would be pretty hard to argue that Google doesn't have the dominant position in search.
You didn't complete the sentence.
Excluding, to the point of excluding all other viable competitors.
Correct.
What do you interpret that to be? You think that means that there is no other viable competitor?
Right. Well, I mean, there are viable. Try to find something that doesn't have in our economy that doesn't have a viable competitor. And then you end up with Ernest's objection is, okay, why is that? Is it because they're prohibited? In other words, they're doing something illegal by which somebody also said cartelling. But then if it's just consumer's choice, that's all it is. It's not a monopoly. It's just consumer preference.
Consumers choose a monopoly 100% of the time when there is a monopoly, because they have.
But there is no monopoly.
But you saying there's never been a monopoly in the history of the world?
No, I'm saying that the common in law and in theory, the basic argument is you can't get a monopoly without building a cartel or getting a special dispensation from a state. And almost no business of any scale that has anything close to monopoly survives the first generation that built it. In other words, 25 years. It's almost impossible.
So aircraft engine companies, GE Aircraft Engines has been around for a really long time. It's really hard to get into the aircraft engine business, and it's really hard to get into the search business. And so if you don't have a huge bucket of money, you're not going to enter those businesses. And especially, again, like, I don't want to digress on monopolies, but I've definitely heard your position. I want to let Michael go. And
it's like, no, you just let me, it's a very, you've picked a really good example of why common people's interpretation of a problem is actually really well understood, and it's really, really well articulated in law. And the answer is, we studied this problem exhaustively, and unless you build a cartel, like the guys tried to do with silver back when I was a kid, unless you build a cartel, it's hard. I mean, the example that survives is the medallion business in New York taxis. That's the example that most people bring up in the field. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, again, I forgot to lower my hand, but waited long enough so that I had another comment. So regarding monopolies, in some industries, monopolies emerge naturally and can be very beneficial for customers because they allow not only to lower prices, but they just allow to simplify the whole, like the whole business for the customers. And Google, it is not monopolist in everything, but it is definitely monopolist in search, in online search. Amazon is practically monopolist in this online market, right? My point is that in these cases, maybe it's not practical to break up these monopolies, but the state, the government should keep them on a short leash, so to say. So it has to regulate them. It has to prevent the abuse of power for these monopolies that we see happens a lot. I just don't see how would you break up someone like
So Michael,
without losing a lot of benefit.
There have been a lot of examples of monopolies broken up in history. Can you think of any one that destroyed the industry where the monopoly was broken up? Or did it actually advance the industry like telecom when Bell Labs was broken up? Did it actually advance the industry and advance innovation? I would actually argue it advanced innovation drastically by breaking up the telephone companies. It drastically reduced costs for consumers and had a huge benefit to the end consumer and a huge increase in innovation. And so actually I would argue monopolies are almost always inherently bad. The difference is we don't know that they're bad because we don't know what's better because we only know the monopoly. And in fact, we don't know anything but the monopoly because it's a monopoly.
No, I don't think that we have monopolies everywhere. But
I'm not saying that there's monopolies everywhere. I'm just saying that when there are monopolies, that it's harmful to the consumer. But that said, I want to let Ralph go.
But I guess my larger point is that if it's not practical to break up monopoly, it has to be treated with care, so to say. Like the example of China, where they have this practically state-owned and state-run companies that are practically monopolies, but they are state-run. And they can be pretty efficient, and the state just prevents them from doing too much harm to the customers.
That's a very debatable question, but let's not go into China's economic policy because that's probably out of the purview of tonight. But saying that Chinese monopolies don't do harm is a whole nother question for another day. I would argue they're stealing IP from around the world left and right through corporate espionage and through cyber hacking on a regular basis.
But this is the state to blame, not the companies.
Let's let Ralph go because he's been waiting.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Michael is making some good points. But the thing is, monopoly is an old term. It has, the way it's defined is, what it is, but it's the discussion should really be broader about when are companies too large, because it's true, there are very few actual real monopolies. Google is not a monopoly, but they are extremely large. They have tremendous market power. But they're a different type of an organization than when this whole conception of monopolies came in, when your company trusts way too big, putting smaller guys out of business and prices rising. So now you have a situation in which, for example, the way the US government, the antitrust division interprets what's bad is if it's going to hurt consumers in the form of higher just higher prices. But there are other things to think about. What are some other harms? I mean, for example, and I'm sure Kurt could talk about this, there's the other side of it, which is monopsony, when you don't have, and the impact and the how dominant players can affect your choice as an employer, right? There's that side of it. And the US government now, as an example, only cares about, based upon what their policy is or who they'll go after is, do they think prices will be increased for consumers? That's really the only focus. Well, maybe that shouldn't be the only focus, right? Because going back to the issue of, providing the most happiness or the most benefit, reducing harm, is an organization that gets too big and too powerful, an organization that can cause harm. Maybe Google is that company. Maybe, according, as Michael said, maybe it's not. But the discussion has to be broader than I think the official definition of a monopoly.
Great, thanks, Ralph. If it's okay, I'm going to go on to the next subject because this one's going to probably digress us a little bit too. Let me see how much we have left. I still want to get to inheritance tax because it's important, but I do think that when we talk about maximizing like fairness, which is about maximizing happiness and minimizing harm, I think that democracy is important. And for those that aren't aware, we are allowed to now give unlimited amounts of money to all levels of politician and judges, and they are allowed to do favors for us in return for that money. And so you can essentially buy political power in the US. It's a little bit indirect, but it's pretty close to direct. And when that's the case, really money does, essentially buy power. And I think that takes the hands out of democracy. Now, it hasn't been taken out of democracy yet, but there has been an incredibly large amount of money that's gone into politics since that law was passed in 2010, or since that was made law in 2010 with the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And not a lot of people are talking about it, although it gets talked about a little bit. And so I would argue that in the interest of fairness, that money should be used for free market decisions, not for buying political power or judgeship power. And so that's, again, I realize controversial, but and political, and I try to avoid political subjects, but in some ways that is unavoidable, because I think it is a key part of an economic system, is what can money be used to buy in an economic system. And I would argue that it should not be able to buy political power, whereas right now it can buy political power. So I'm curious if anyone wants to defend buying political power with money in an economic system.
I don't want to defend it. The problem is interesting in that it's not so much that you can buy. The problem is giving the public information necessary to make a decision. So who's that information going to come from? Is it going to come from politicians? Is it going to come from public intellectuals? Who's it going to come from? The problem is usually that the reason we have houses of government, same reason we have juries, is that the idea has always been that the size of the jury is related to the size, how many people would need to be bribed. The problem with having representatives in the government is that it is now possible, given the size of our economy, to bribe enough of the government to make a policy change. So the only way, of course, fixing that is eliminating the politicians. The way you eliminate the politicians, you have to go to the people. The problem then is, okay, we've eliminated the ability to bribe, which is what you were talking about, but we haven't eliminated the problem of how do people get truthful information about policy.
So wouldn't another way to be just to not allow unlimited money to be given to politicians and judges to get them into positions of power, which is what it was before 2010? You couldn't bribe them. Like, it was illegal. It was illegal to bribe before 2010. Now you're allowed to bribe. It's legal.
Well, okay. So the problem is, I mean, Fukuyama goes over this in detail, but I mean, America did not develop, in other words, America's political system, in other words, our bureaucracy, is still, is still a clientelistic system. So, I mean, if we want to start there, I would have to go all the way back. I don't think money should be used for it at all. I'd like the people get up there and just say the speech, but then it turns out that a third of us are informed on the right, a third of us are informed on the left, and the third in the middle just goes with whatever feels good. And so the problem is the informed people rarely make the decision. It's that whatever scarce information is emotively presented to the middle that makes the difference. And it's quite frustrating that that's the case. So I would say, okay, well, we can talk about bribing the politicians, but how are we going to get money to reach people so that people have information to make decisions by? So I would keep saying this over and over again. We're trying to get people to act like they're not people, when instead the problem is we've got people in the way and no way to get truthful information to the public. So I mean, I just think we always try to solve the wrong question.
Michael, did you have your hand up from before, or did you have a question?
No, this time I raised my hand on purpose.
Go ahead.
So I'm not going to defend money in politics. That's bad. But I rather have a point about this one person, one vote. So the point is that the United States is probably the only country of this size, I mean, in terms of population and territory and whatever, which had more or less successful democracy. This is debatable, I understand, but I think that a part of this is because this was always intended as the union between the states. And the states still have a lot of like their own freedom, and they're the states. So the name speaks for itself. So the United States are similar to the European Union. And if we try to make it working more like one central country, like France or Germany or whatever, like removing this state autonomy in making decisions, I am not sure that it will work. We have too large and too diverse country for this. So I realize that this is too big topic, and maybe we need a separate discussion for this. But I just remind you that we have to keep it in mind.
Yeah, I think monopolies and money and politics are probably good topics for another night. So that said, I do think that there are times when, even in like, while I've been arguing that it's good to have competitors, I would recognize that there are certain areas where it doesn't make sense to have competitors, like sewer systems, right? You don't want to build 5 sewer systems in the same city. That's super inefficient, and you just don't have enough space for it. So it makes more sense to have one player and, regulate profitability, which is what we do with electric companies, although we've deregulated that too, so that there is still competition in the areas that there can be. But then you have regulation and limit profitability so that people don't charge ridiculously high electric fees, because we all need electricity, and everyone's going to pay whatever they can to get electricity. So just recognizing some of that, but I think that's probably not that controversial, so I'll just move through it quickly and just say that this is what for those that were in the TED Talk group, we had a TED Talk about telling which companies are ethical in a free market system. And I would argue that's generally pretty hard to do. And the guy in the TED Talk was talking about how his company has a not-for-profit that tells you how ethical companies are. And I use an app for that. I think it's called The Better World. I forget. But like, there are ways to tell which companies are more or less ethical. And I want to, encourage people that I think it's a good thing to be aware of the level of ethics and that the companies that you shop from have, and to choose to shop from more ethical companies. And someone mentioned, you know, Amazon has a, you know, more or less a monopoly, and they used to pay some of their workers so little money that they were on food stamps. And, you know, we know that Jeff Bezos has quite a bit of money and is not doing so poorly. He's got a few extra Ferraris to drive around, and yet some of his employees were, you know, making so little money that they were on food stamps. Because of political pressure, that got remedied. But I will say, like, it's important to, you know, shop with your conscience, in my opinion, and shop for companies that align with the ethics that you have. And if you think that, you know, that's the right ethical thing to do, cool, like, you know, shop with the companies that do those things. But if you have no choices and like the only game of town is one, or like it's impractical to use anyone else, then that becomes a little more problematic. But I don't mean to go back to monopolies. I do think that, you know, Michael mentioned externalities and greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and depletion of natural resources. I would put these in the same sort of category as what I mentioned around cigarette tax. Is if a company is causing greenhouse gas emissions, we should try to figure out how much money does it cost to remove those greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and we should be taxing the people who release greenhouse gases with enough money that we can, you know, undo the damage that's done. And so there should be a net neutral for people who cause harm to the environment to clean up the environment with the taxes that we charge the people who are harming the environment. And so that's kind of how I would approach it, like how I would propose approaching it. Michael, go ahead.
I agree with this classification. I just wanted to be sure that this is mentioned, because this is one of the biggest problems with capitalist economy, with market economy.
I agree.
That,
I think it is a big problem.
It always creates externalities of various kinds, and it does not care to repair the harm. So.
Right. I agree. It's a big problem. And that's part of why I think it's important that, you know, we be visionary about how we could do it. And I'm not trying to solve the problem and say exactly how much should we charge carbon to like be able to recover, because I don't know the answer to that. But saying that we should charge enough to be able to recover from the harm done, you know, I think is a logical paradigm to follow and something to strive for, and gives us like at least a direction to work in. That's, I think, better than where we are today, which is just completely ignoring externalities and pretending they don't exist, la 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 la. You know, that's not, to me, like a good place to be. And that said, I do want to get into probably the last maybe there's two more topics, but I want to talk a little bit about inheritance tax. So this is going to be controversial, but I guess I have a belief that you know, being born to wealthy parents is kind of like you do get a lot of benefits being born to wealthy parents, because you're afforded a lot of things that people born to poor parents don't have. But I think that you know, Jeff Bezos's family never having to work a day in their lives for the next 100 generations feels very unfair to me. And that is the reality that we live in today, is that his family for the next 100 generations, maybe further, won't have to work. And, you know, if they're careful with their money, it'll last forever, or indefinitely, I should say, and no one's that careful. But long story short, I think that there should be, over some specific number, I throw $10 million out there just as a random example, 10 million per child. But like I said, I don't want to get into like how much money, but I think there should be a dollar amount that's like enough that makes parents want to save their money to pass on money to their kids, that they can like pass money on to their kids so that their kids will live a happier life and not have to be as worry as much about money as maybe their parents had to. And I think that's good to have some level of intergenerational wealth passed on. But I think there should be some limit where above a certain amount, and you know, that you know, money is basically taxed and used to fund you know, things like giving free higher education to you know, to people in society, to invest in society as a whole, and be more of a meritocracy rather than a dynastic wealth community. And for me, like, you know, having, you know, unlimited amounts of money be inherited, which you can do through trusts and creative inheritance techniques, seems very counter fairness. So I'm curious if anyone wants to disagree with that, or what people's opinions are. Sean,
I'll disagree with it if somebody else doesn't have anything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think you made a good point that then that up to a certain point, there should be no inheritance tax. I agree with that. But I just wanted to point out that society is more like a run on a family structure. And let's say if we create an inheritance tax, what are the incentives that are going to create? That what that basically does is, it would most probably incentivize people to spend as much as they can during their lifetime, so that it won't probably get passed down. That would be the biggest thing. Now, is that a good thing? It's like you'll say they're spending more during their lifetime. It's going more into the economy, so it's better for the economy. But most people wouldn't want to do that, right? I was just wondering, most people work so that, they work for their family. They want to give their family a better life than they had. So I just wanted to point that out. I mean, there are going to be certain incentives, and I'm much more worried about what incentives the inheritance tax would create than what we think it would benefit.
Great, thanks, Shaunak. Ernest.
Yeah.
Kurt, I want to encourage you to raise your hand, Kurt, so that you can go as well.
Bring up the crisis in our borders.
Ernest, I think, was Ernest.
Okay.
How do you raise your hand, by the way?
Oh, I'm sorry. Kurt, if you don't know how, do you mind, Ernest, if we let Kurt go? Because he did speak up earlier.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know you didn't know how, Kurt. So just, Kurt, to let you know, under the bottom menu, there's, where is it?
Participants.
Reactions.
Reactions, yeah, it's under reactions.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I learned something new today.
There you go. That's a good thing. That's what we're here for. Is to learn.
I only pretty much live on this thing.
There you go. All right, so Kurt, go ahead.
This is the problem with stories versus examples. The first thing we know is that, if we look at this, the data on this, which is pretty overwhelming, there's two things that are really obvious. One is that wealth almost never lasts beyond the third generation. In other words, if you make it, your kids are okay and it's gone. My grandfather, my great-grandfather was fabulously wealthy. And in my generation, it's gone, right? And that's really, really common. My grandmother's is only 4 generations from Scottish nobility. It's gone. So if I look at, because I'm playing this game, if I look at the top 80, there's about 80 families in the country who have a lot of intergenerational money. They're not hard to find out. Now, if you look at how much money they have, it doesn't even register. Compared to what the government has. What do you think their return on capital is versus how well the government uses the money? Right. Look at what Elon Musk's return on capital is right now versus that. So the problem is that these guys, they start with actually a fairly small amount of money, and they make phenomenal economic difference across the country. And so the problem when you have it is if you can hold money over 3 generations, it means you're freaking good at it because it's hard. So there's people like in Italy that have been in the same wealthy families since the 1400s. There's people in England that are the same way, not many, but it's because for political differences. But I mean, the problem is competency. So I always see this as a very envious and uninformed position, is that the truth is that this money goes away very quickly, and if it doesn't, it's because the people who are running it are doing fabulous things with it. I don't know if any of you guys are from the upper 1% or not, but do you have any idea how hard it is to hold on to $10 million once you've got it? I mean, it's a dead heat race. It's the thing I hated most about being rich. I mean, you spend your whole life trying not to lose the money you've made. I see it as a made up story so people feel good. The real problem is, why does the government produce such shitty returns on capital? Why? That's the problem. Anyway, that's my point.
I guess, Kurt, though, like if you want to go to the YouTube video from I think it was a week ago, I basically taught how you can indefinitely maintain generational wealth with very little effort. Quite frankly, it's not hard. It's really not. So
is that theoretically or empirically?
It's empirically over the last 100 years. If you use the strategy that I talk about, you will retain generational wealth. Period.
No, you ran a model. I'm saying, who has done that?
So I didn't research every single human being that's existed for the last 100 years and how they invested their money. So if that's what you're asking, I didn't do that. But I can tell you that 10% of people do actually retain their wealth more than 3 generations. That said, Ernest, I want to let you go.
Well, I just want to mention that what Forbes magazine published, the wealth of the people, it's actually, they don't have it in cash. Okay, you have to understand all of their money invested, even Jeffrey Bezos. But let's talk about Elon Musk, number 2. He doesn't own a house, doesn't own a car. He leases all the stuff. All the money invested in different companies that produce jobs. Okay, I live in Canada, and I wish we had somebody like him, and they would even lower taxes for him to create so many jobs that he does in the United States. You have to understand, this money, it's not, he doesn't use for personal gain, it's for everybody's gain. Everybody benefits from his company. And it would be, in my personal opinion.
And no one, by the way, no one is talking about taxing Elon Musk during his life. It's talking, what I'm proposing is that after Elon Musk dies, that Elon Musk's kids are not as good at handling wealth, because I agree with Kurt that people who are good at handling money should be able to have it. But I don't agree that just because someone is a child of someone who handled money well, that they are inherently better at handling money than poor people. You know, some poor people are better at handling money, and that's why they become wealthy. And so all I'm saying is that we should give people an equal starting point on earth, and not say that just because you were born to a wealthy family, you have, what could potentially be, 50 generations of wealth, which the Rockefellers still have plenty of wealth, right? So some families do maintain it. But
okay, I understand what you're saying, but it's like, I have a house, okay? When my children will inherit my house, how are they going to pay money from his children will inherit his businesses? How they can pay taxes from his businesses if it's X-Space or whatever companies they have? It's inherited, they get shares. It's not
businesses are not generally inherited. Businesses are usually passed on to new leaders. Now, family businesses are often inherited, but that's an exception to the rule. I would be surprised if Elon Musk's businesses are inherited by his kids. That would surprise me, quite frankly. I don't see him as the kind of guy that would do that.
He will have shares. His shares in the company will be inherited.
Perhaps, but not the leadership of the company. And
yes,
again, that's what we're talking about, is whether or not wealth should be dynastic. And it sounds like you agree that it should be dynastic, and people shouldn't have to work for 100 generations in their life if they were born to a wealthy family, which is fine. Like you're entitled to that opinion. Like that's what Kurt says too. So Trevor, Kurt says that they won't last that long. But
I agree.
But
I agree with Kurt. Yes.
Yeah.
In Trevor, practice, I know theoretically it should last, but in practice, unfortunately, it doesn't last.
Great. Trevor, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Again, I just want to draw attention to the axioms that all our proposals rest upon. So, for example, this inheritance tax, whatever you want to call it, I think it's certainly arguable that this is a good idea, that it should be capped in some capacity. Like an optimal system, I think, would have some sort of a cap. Let's say, as a thought experiment, we can determine what the optimal level is. By some means, we've been able to determine this. The problem is the system that governs our laws, so-called representative democracy. The odds of this implementing it are somewhere in the neighborhood of 0. If you look at probably the most beneficial change we could make, which would be Medicare for all, single payer health delivery with some sort of private sector supplement. This has support across the political spectrum. It has huge support among Democrats, and it has greater than 50% support among Republicans. But if you simply observe what politicians say, including politicians who often proclaim to be diehard supporters of it, like AOC, it is clear that the political game and politicians are not truly trying to represent the will of the people. So, not to be a pessimist, but well-meaning people like us can get together in meetups for the rest of our life. But if the system that underlies all of this is not truly democratic, which appears to be the case, are we not wasting our time?
So I hear what you're saying, Trevor, and we were talking in the beginning how we want to be idealistic, realistic idealists, and so totally get what you're saying. And actually, the data supports what you're saying, Trevor, which is that in general, money makes decisions more, like money in politics makes decisions way like almost all the time, and democratic popularity is almost never the decision maker for what becomes policy. It's almost always follow the money, and whoever's got more money and donating more money to politicians is who gets what they want. So you're absolutely right pragmatically. Now, could that ever change? I think it could. I'm, trying to bring about things that might make that change someday, and I hope that a lot of other people will join me, and if enough people do, someday that could change, in my opinion. That said,
isn't that where the public attention and discourse should be on? Is on the most fundamentally important problem in the system.
I agree with you that having democracy, and democratic popularity of decisions should be. We should talk about that another night, because we're a little bit after 9 o'clock, and so I want to sort of let Remco go, and then I think I have one more thing that I want to cover that's very short and probably non-controversial, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So Remco, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. Look, I made some comments while the discussion was rolling up above. You can have a look at them later on. Look, after this, I think I'll probably dip out of the conversation because we're getting into detail, and I have a problem with detail unless I have a framework from which to have a conversation. I don't feel that framework. Look, there's some very serious problems. So in there, let's take the United States, for example, and I'm addressing the topic of taxation. It has taken 50 years for the average minimum wage in America to catch up to where it was 50 years ago. So something has happened. Something serious has happened in the United States with all that productivity gain over 50 years since 1970. All of that has been squirreled and taken away from the average person. It's a serious indicator of something is wrong. And so obviously wealth is being taken away from the individual, away from the shareholders, as we are, and the taxation system is therefore seriously flawed. And one indicator of that is that the top 25 income earners in the United States pay about over a 4-year period, have paid 3.4% tax on their accumulated income. In comparison, look, I'm talking on top of my head now. In comparison, the average income earner has paid 95% tax on their increased net value. I can actually quantify it and give references to that. What I'm trying to say is, in the end, the system is flawed. So how do we deal with it? Well, income tax is one, a tax on wealth is another, and tax on spending is another. There are 3 sources where the government can draw its taxation, and I think it needs to be put up front. 3 sources. We tend to focus on income and ignore the others, and we need to really be clear on that. In what ways should be, there is a need for income. Where should it, taxation, where should it come from, and how should it be allocated, and what are some of the drivers? It's a topic in its own right. It needs to be extended. Anyway, look, I don't know whether I'm making a lot of sense, but I think we need to go back to fundamentals. I'm sorry, Garrett, I'm going to have to dip out at this point because I think I would only be distracting your stream of conversation. But I really think we need to go right back to the beginning and say, what are we really about? What do we want to achieve? And by the way, is there such a thing as capitalism? I suggest it's a nonsense. I think we need to drop the term because it only has existence relative to communism. And if we don't have communism, then what do we have? We have a society that's buzzing, and we can use whatever title we like. I think it's emotively loaded to talk in terms of capitalism and non-capitalism. I think the template for my mindset, and this is my concluding mindset, my template for a mindset is Michael Porter's Competitive Advantage of Nations. And he talks about not picking winners, creating a viable stage for activities to happen, and not to pick winners, but by and large just to butt out, promote conditions for activity to happen. But anyway, as I said, that's my thought, Garrett. I wrote some thoughts earlier. Take it for what it's worth, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Remco. Really appreciate it, and good points as always. Shauna, go ahead next.
Yeah, just another thing about the inherent tax and, in taxation, high taxation in general. You were talking about, people do not really have, like, falling generations usually do not have high return on capital. One thing that, that must be taken into account, that one person makes the wealth, obviously one person has multiple people in his generation and it gets divided out. That's why, it's not kept in, let's say, it's not accumulated in one person. That's one thing. Another reason is the parents who make the money, they don't really pass on the skills to how to keep the money. That's extremely difficult to do. Another thing is, if you're talking about return on capital, okay, who has the best chance of getting better return on capital? The alternative, you're saying, by any sort of taxation, is basically take the money from the people and give it to the government. And my problem with that, the government has really bad returns on capital, in generally speaking. So it's like, that's one of my biggest gripes against high taxation, is like you're taking money from the people and giving it to the taxation with the hope that the government will make better use of that money, which the government really never does, empirically speaking. So just putting that out as well.
So if I can give a quick counter to that, all of the wealth created in society is actually a result of government investment, because we wouldn't have any wealth creation if we didn't have contractual enforcement, a legal system, police, an army to defend us from invaders who would steal all our wealth. All of that comes from taxes. So actually, without taxes, you would literally have no wealth creation in society as well. If you want to go to Somalia and see what it looks like without taxes, you can try to live in Somalia for a while and see how it works in a government without taxes.
No.
It doesn't work out very well. So government's return on investment is
That's not an
honest
argument.
I'm not saying any taxation. Taxation. Let's consider taxation as a bill for living in a sane society. I'm not against taxation. I would say I have a gripe against high taxation. So that there's a difference there. So
again, we're not talking about quantities of how much. We're talking about whether or not something makes sense at a certain point. And someone made the point that at some point, and I think it was Trevor that said, at some point, yes, it makes sense to have a tax for inheritance. Now, I'm not saying it's $10 million, maybe it's $100 million. And quite frankly, that relates to like a very, very small fraction of the population. But does it make sense at 100 million? Does it make sense at $1 billion? Does it make sense at $1 trillion? Are you saying absolutely no limit whatsoever, or does it make sense at some point? And you can each make your own decision up on that. I don't want to debate the dollar amount, like I said. I just want to have the conversation about pros and cons and reasons to do one or the other. The last thing I want to end with is that that I think that some form of, or some percentage of, part of the economy is teaching practical life skills, which is what the Freethinker Institute is about. A lot of what we did today is practicing our critical thinking skills, which is a key part of what we want to do as this organization, is to allow different ideas in and have all perspectives represented and let everybody voice their opinion and say what they think, and not only what they think, but why they think it and the rationale. And I think it's really important to teach practical life skills. And so I think that some percentage of the economy should go towards enabling people to have practical life skills and sort of being taught practical life skills, because that's not historically taught in academia. It's not historically taught in, like any sort of regimented way that I know of. Although if anyone knows of one that it is, let me know offline. That said, or feel free to speak up.
They're actually afraid. They're afraid to teach it because one of the things that happens when they try is that it identifies the social and class differences between the students in the classroom, and they found it to be alienating.
It's interesting, Kurt. If you have like a study on that, I'd love to read it, to be honest. It sounds like you've read about it. So Michael, I want to let you go next.
Yeah, just wanted to say that I added the whole section that I called business work fairness. And this is something that people are doing in other countries in Europe, but it's almost completely overlooked here. And people are spending at work a big part of their life, so sort of important.
Great. Thanks for that, Michael. And Kurt, I'm not saying that flippantly. Like, I'm genuinely curious because I think teaching critical thinking skills is super, super important. And I do agree with you that there's some reason that people aren't teaching it. And I'd love to learn more about what that reason is and try to come up with a counter argument to it.
It's a nightmare. If you look at there's 4 great society policies that have failed dramatically, and education, of course, is the most obvious of them, which is showing up everywhere. But anyway, so I gave you one example. The other is that parents don't like it when children come home and call them stupid. And that's the other thing that happens. And so we've, I don't want to get into it, but those are the 2 canonical problems that are raised, that come back from teachers who, of course, are trying to be pseudo parents, and they don't like being put in a position between parents and children.
I would love my kids to make me look stupid. That would make me happy. I'd be proud of them.
Well, that's what makes you middle class. The problem is,
I'm not middle class actually, but thank you.
Well, whatever. I mean, I'm saying the point is that middle class ethics is what I mean. The problem is that not all people have middle class ethics.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I definitely grew up probably lower than middle class. So anyway, I do want to kind of close things out. And I just really want to thank you guys for a super cool, very interesting conversation. We had really diverse viewpoints, which I really appreciate. That's a key part of like what we want to do as an organization, is get people with different perspectives in a room together, talking about things in a very polite, intellectually curious way, and sharing good ideas and exposing people's ideas that they may not otherwise be exposed to. And, ultimately each one of us should use our own critical thinking skills to decide what resonates the most with us. And for me, that's what, life is about, is teaching people to think for themselves. And that's what the organization is about, is teaching people to think for themselves. And maybe someone is not going to like me, Kurt, for that, but it is what it is. That's why I'm kind of curious to know about where I can read more about why people don't want to teach critical thinking skills. Because
it's not critical thinking skills. It's anything to do with economics, politics, and law.
Got it. Okay, well, that's even broader. That's
and hold on. And then the other problem is they remove the sequence, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They've of course limited all three because, of course, what do you think it makes you able to have critical thinking skills? It's the formation of grammatically correct sentences, prohibits you from making conflations, inflations, and errors of induction, deduction, and fictionalism. So the problem is they've eradicated everything in order to decrease the responsibility of the state for producing measurable outputs that produce a child that is employable by the graduation of 12th grade. Anyway, I won't go into this in any more detail, but that's what it is. Great. Anyway, Ernest, I just want to say, Ernest, you're a smart guy. I'm glad I met you.
I agree with you, Kurt. But point is, Garrett, it's we need to make incremental changes. We cannot revolutionize. My question to you, Garrett, which specific subject, if we work on something specific, we cannot go education and medical services on all different areas. But if we can improve most, where we have to find where we can improve most on current system. It's 99% there. We need to make incremental changes.
Right. I agree with you, Ernest. And that's actually what my paper on being a realistic idealist is about, is create an ideal that might be 100 years away, but then make incremental changes 1 year at a time to work towards that ideal with a long-term plan, short, medium, and long-term plan. So I agree with you 110%, Ernest. We need to make incremental changes. As to your question about where do we make them, I'd argue we're a big country and we're a big world, and let's work together to change, make incremental changes in all the areas that we can make progress, because we have a lot of people, and if we coordinate and focus on, making incremental changes in all the areas that we can, we'll make a lot more progress collaboratively. And I have a saying, if we don't help each other, who's going to help us? Let's help each other make incremental changes for the better. And the way we do that is through freely sharing ideas, thinking for ourselves, being open to new ideas, and not just succumbing to critical confirmation bias, which I think is enemy number one of society today, which is just agreeing that we are thinking that we already know the answers. Let's be open to new ideas that teach us new truths to be the best version of ourselves, use our critical thinking skills to make better decisions, and then collaboratively work to increase happiness and decrease harm once we have a clear picture of the truth and we're being the best version of ourselves. So that's really what the Freethinker Institute is about. And so I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. And I hope you guys will come next week. We're going to keep having these sessions every Tuesday, hopefully, for the foreseeable future. And we've got lots more planned and cool speakers coming up. So thanks everyone for coming. Fill out our survey when you get it. You will get a survey about how you like the session, and we value your feedback. And there may also be a survey about future topics, and we would love your feedback on that as well. So thanks a lot, everybody. Hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.